2 decades had passed since that winter morning in 2005, but to the people of Melbourne's outer suburbs, its memory clung to them like the fog that rolled in off the Yarra River. The city was different, with new buildings and new faces, but to one family it was as if time had stopped still. Every anniversary was a torn-open wound, a headline revisited, a reminder of a name that would eternally be synonymous with tragedy, Sarah McIntyre. She was just 23 years old when she disappeared, walking home from her late shift at a cafe on Collins Street. One moment she was there, laughing with her co-workers, and the next, she was gone. Her case had been filed, reopened, and shelved again for years. Detectives came and went. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved away. The case went cold, frozen in the layers of bureaucracy and faded hope. But then, early in 2025, a name resurfaced in the investigation. A name no one in the community could have imagined. Detective Inspector Claire Hensley still remembered the original file. She had been a rookie back then, barely out of academy training, and Sarah's photo had haunted her for decades. "It never left me," she would later tell reporters. "It was one of those cases that burned into your memory, the kind you can't shake, even when you try." When new forensic technology arrived that could test the greatest samples from the early 2000s, Claire quietly sent off one of Sarah's preserved evidence swabs. No one expected anything to come back, but it did. But then the lab found a partial DNA match in the national database to someone who incredibly had lived less than 3 blocks from Sarah at the time of her disappearance. It was a name, Daniel Kearns, now in his mid-40s, married with 2 kids, a respected local business owner. He ran a small construction firm, sponsored local youth sports, and even was featured in a neighborhood magazine a few years back for community contributions. When police arrived at his home on a quiet Sunday morning in March 2025, neighbors thought it was some mistake. But within hours, the news spread like wildfire. "They took Daniel away in handcuffs," said one resident, shaking her head. "He was the last person anyone would suspect. I mean, he'd helped shovel snow, fix fences, just an ordinary bloke." But inside the detective unit, the mood was electric, tense, and cautious. This wasn't just a case reopening. It was a reckoning, one that connected decades of pain, unanswered questions, and a long shadow from a single night back in 2005. As officers began to re-examine the timeline, they realized how easily Kearns had slipped through the cracks. Back then, he was a 25-year-old tradesman who lived nearby and had even volunteered one of the early community searches for Sarah. Claire sat in the interview room, her eyes fixed on Kearns through the glass. He looked calm, almost detached, as if this were all some misunderstanding. "Mr. Kearns," she began, her voice steady but firm, "we've reopened the McIntyre case. You remember Sarah, don't you?" There was a long pause. Kearns blinked, leaned back and nodded. "Yeah, everyone remembers her. Terrible thing. We found DNA evidence that places you near her at the time she disappeared," Claire continued, studying his reaction. "Would you like to explain that?" His jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed nothing. "You must have made a mistake," he said. "I didn't even know her." But the evidence told another story. The DNA had been detected on a piece of Sarah's jacket, which was found weeks after she disappeared in a vacant lot near Richmond. At the time, in 2005, testing methods were not sensitive enough to detect the partial trace. Now, 2 decades on, it was enough to light a fuse that would explode across Melbourne's news cycle. As journalists swarmed the police headquarters, old memories swept across the city like a wave. The posters, the candle vigils, a young woman's face on nightly broadcasts. For Sarah's parents, now in their 70s, a telephone call came like a ghost returning. "After all these years," her mother whispered to a reporter that afternoon, "we thought we'd never hear her name again. But hearing it like this, I don't know if it's relief or heartbreak." The investigation moved fast. Search warrants were executed on Kearns's properties. Detectives found old journals, receipts, and even a second-hand car he'd owned back in 2005. They also discovered something quite unexpected, a series of anonymous letters that had been mailed to Sarah's family in the months after she disappeared. The handwriting analysis suggested they could have come from the same person now under arrest. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, Kearns maintained his innocence. His lawyer called the case a gross overreach and a misuse of speculative science. But in the court of public opinion, the damage was done. The community that once saw him as a model citizen now eyed him with suspicion and disbelief. Behind closed doors, Claire knew this case was more than an exercise in catching a suspect. It was one of redemption. For years, she'd carried Sarah's case file in her desk drawer, a silent reminder of unfinished business. Now, as she prepared to question Kearns again, one question that had haunted her for 20 years refused to go away. Why Sarah? Because the thing about cases like this, and people like Kearns, is that the truth, when it finally comes out, is never as simple as anyone expects. In the sterile glow of the interview room, the tension hung thick. Detective Claire Hensley folded her hands on the table, eyes locked on Daniel Kearns. Between them lay the printed DNA report, a quiet bomb waiting to detonate. Outside, the city carried on, trams rattling, people laughing in cafes, completely unaware that 2 decades of silence were about to be broken wide open. Claire spoke softly, the kind of calm that only comes from years of practice. Dan, we've spoken to a lot of people about that night. Some remembered you being at the cafe earlier in the evening. You said you didn't know Sarah, but your name came up more than once. Why is that? Kearns let out a slow breath, the fingers of one hand drumming against the metal table. I was there, sure. I stopped in for coffee after work. But I didn't talk to her. I didn't even notice her. That's strange, Claire replied, because one of her co-workers said you'd been in a few times that week. Said Sarah mentioned you. Said you were friendly. Kearns's jaw tightened. People talk. Maybe she mistook me for someone else. The detective leaned forward. We both know that's not true. For a long time, Kearns said nothing. He stared at the table, lost in thought, his reflection distorted by the dull metal. Then he looked up, and for the first time there was a flicker of something, fear, maybe, or regret. You've already decided I'm guilty, he said quietly. Claire said nothing. There was a silence that extended until it was almost intolerable. She finally stood, gathered the photographs, and exited the room. As the door closed behind her, Kearns' facade cracked just enough, a curl of the lip, a shallow breath, and the camera in the corner caught every second. Outside, the task force worked around the clock. Forensic analysts cross-referenced samples, digital technicians pulled old call logs, and a new team of detectives canvassed the neighborhoods in which Sarah used to live. They tracked down her old co-workers, now scattered across Australia. Some had families of their own, others had changed names, but all remembered her. She was always smiling, recalled one woman. Even after those long shifts, she'd walk home with her headphones in. Everyone told her it wasn't safe that late, but she just laughed it off. Said she liked the quiet. Quiet. That's what haunted everyone, the thought that Sarah might have called for help and no one heard her. Back at the station, Claire sifted through boxes of archived evidence. Old Polaroids, type reports, bags of faded clothing. Everything smelled faintly of dust and paper. Then she saw it. An unlogged item from the original scene. A strand of hair sealed inside a small envelope marked found near the jacket site. It had never been tested. She took it straight to the lab. Days later, the results came back. The hair belonged to Sarah, but embedded within it was a trace of male skin cells. The DNA matched Daniel Kearns. It was a breakthrough, and this time there was no room for doubt. But one question remained. What had happened that night? According to records, Sarah clocked out at 11:37 p.m. Security footage from a nearby store recorded her walking down Swanston Street at 11:49. At 11:55, her phone connected to a tower near Richmond. After that, nothing. No pings, no calls, no trace. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. Now, with Kearns' arrest, the map started to take shape again. He lived just 4 blocks from that last phone ping. He owned a white utility van that had never been examined. An old neighbor, long forgotten, reached out after seeing the news. I remember that van, the man said. Back in 2005, he was washing it at 2 in the morning. Thought it was odd at the time, but he said he'd spill paint. The statement went into the official record. Another piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. When confronted with the evidence, Kearns didn't deny washing the van. "I was working on a renovation job," he said. "Had to clean up before a morning delivery." But his story fell apart when investigators found microscopic traces of blood in the seams of the van's flooring, blood that DNA confirmed was Sarah's. The press exploded. Headlines screamed across Australia. Cold case breakthrough after 20 years. Local man charged with 2005 murder. TV anchors replayed clips of Kearns being led in handcuffs to the police station, his face hidden behind a jacket. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. But amidst the frenzy, there was a quieter reaction, the people who had lived through the pain. Sarah's parents sat in their small living room, surrounded by framed photographs. "We thought the world had forgotten," Linda said softly. "Now it's like she's everywhere again. Her face is on the news, her story's being told. But it still hurts just the same." Tom sat beside her, staring at the TV, his hands clasped tight. "I used to walk those streets at night hoping I'd see her," he murmured. "Just once. Just to know she was still out there." In another part of Melbourne, Kearns's wife broke her silence. "I can't believe this," she told reporters with tears streaming down her face. "He's been my husband for 15 years. He's a good father. There has to be some mistake." The case divided the community. Some thought the evidence was airtight. Others said there had to be more to the story. Social media turned into a battlefield of opinions. But the one thing everyone did agree on was that the truth, whatever it was, had been buried for too long. Late one night, Claire made her way to the lot where Sarah's jacket was found. Now it was overgrown, fenced off, and silent except for the hum of cars passing. She stood there under the streetlight, her breath visible in the cool air, and whispered, "We didn't forget you." Sometimes closure doesn't feel like relief. Sometimes it just feels like the echo of everything lost. The next morning, as detectives prepared to bring Kearns in for another round of questioning, he surprised them. He asked to speak privately with Claire. When she came into the room, he no longer looked defiant. He slumped his shoulders and his eyes were bloodshot. "I can't sleep," he said in a quiet voice. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her. I've seen her for years." Claire said nothing. She simply waited. Kearns exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "You want the truth? I'll tell you everything." The only sound in the confession room was the soft hum of the recording device. Claire pressed the red button, leaned back, and looked at Kearns. His hands, resting on the table, shook very slightly, and for the first time since his arrest, the mask of confidence he had been wearing started to break down. "I never meant for it to happen," he started. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." Claire did not respond. She knew silence could be louder than interrogation. "She was just walking home," Kearns said, eyes distant, as though the memory were playing on a screen only he could see. "It was raining that night. I saw her crossing the street near the tram stop. She looked upset. I pulled over, offered her a lift. She hesitated at first, but she recognized me from the cafe. I thought I was helping." Claire's stomach twisted. "And then?" He swallowed hard. "She got in. We talked for a while, about work, about life, about how cold it was. But then she said something that made me angry. She said I made her uncomfortable the last time I was there. I didn't mean to, honestly, I didn't. But she said she was going to tell her manager." His voice cracked. "I panicked. I told her I was sorry, but she kept saying she wanted to get out. I pulled over near the river. She opened the door and tried to leave. I grabbed her arm to stop her. She screamed." The words tumbled out halting, raw, and dripping with guilt. Claire could almost see it. The rain-slick road, the glow of the streetlights, the hiss of tires on the wet pavement. A night frozen in time, unraveling piece by piece. "I tried to quiet her down," Kearns said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted her to stop screaming. And then, I don't even know how it happened. She fell, hit her head on the side of the van. There was blood, So much blood. Claire stared at him, her heart pounding. What did you do then? He rubbed his face with his hands, muffling his voice. I panicked. I tried to wake her up, but she wasn't breathing. I thought I'd killed her. I didn't know what to do. I drove for hours, just driving. Finally, I stopped at that vacant lot and laid her down. I didn't want anyone to find her like that, but I couldn't bring myself to. I just left her there. The room was completely silent. It seemed that even the air held its breath. Kearns looked up, tears now streaking his face. I didn't mean to take her life. I've thought about her every single day since. Every time I saw her picture in the paper, I wanted to turn myself in. But then I'd look at my wife, my kids, and I couldn't. Claire scribbled a note quietly. Unintentional escalation. Panic disposal. Conscious guilt. Yet in her head she replayed the years of silence, vigils, and tears of a mother who had buried an empty coffin. There was no accident that could justify that kind of pain. When the recording was over, Kearns slumped in his chair, as though the confession had siphoned out whatever humanity was left. Officers came in to escort him back to holding. Claire remained seated for a while, staring at the blank wall. Confessions were supposed to bring closure, but this one felt hollow, like a door had opened only to reveal another locked room. Later that day, the news of his confession leaked to the press. News anchors spoke in somber tones. Again and again on a loop came the footage of him saying, after 2 decades, the man responsible for the death of Sarah McIntyre has confessed. But reactions were not straightforward. Some people wept in relief. Others were infuriated that Kearns had lived a full life, while Sarah's had been cut short. Outside the courthouse, Sarah's parents stood before a sea of microphones. Her mother clutched a small framed photo of her daughter, young, bright-eyed, her smile frozen in time. We waited 20 years for answers, she said softly. Now we finally know what happened, but knowing doesn't make it hurt less. It just makes it real. Her father's voice shook as he added, we forgive him, but we'll never forget what he took from us. That line made headlines across the country. Inside police headquarters, Claire met with her team. The confession was solid, but of course the investigation had to continue. They needed corroboration in the form of details only the killer would know. Forensic units returned to the original scene with modern equipment. Deep scans of the soil showed signs of fabric fibers and traces of blood consistent with Sarah's DNA. Enough to close the evidentiary circle. But there was something about it that still didn't sit right with Claire. Kearns had described Sarah falling and hitting her head. The coroner's original report, however, had listed multiple injuries, defensive wounds, bruising inconsistent with a single fall. Either he was lying to minimize what happened, or he wasn't alone. That night, Claire sat at her desk, staring at the timeline pinned to the corkboard. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Detective Leo Burns, one of the younger officers. "Ma'am," he said, holding a tablet. "You need to see this." He played a restored piece of CCTV footage from a tram stop camera dated the night Sarah disappeared. The video was grainy but clear enough to make out 2 figures. One was unmistakably Sarah. The other, a man stepping out of a van, looked like Kearns. But there was something else. A second man sitting in the passenger seat. Claire's blood ran cold. "Who's that?" she whispered. Burns leaned in closer. The face was partially obscured, but the timestamp put him there at the exact time Sarah disappeared. "We ran enhancement software," he said. "You're not going to believe this. It's Jason Miller, Kearns' old business partner." The weight of realization pressed down on Claire's chest. The case wasn't over. The confession was only half the truth. She watched the footage once again, frozen on that blurry face. "We've been chasing the wrong ghost," she murmured. The next morning, search warrants went out for Miller's home and property. What they found there would unravel the case all over again. The sun hadn't yet risen when detectives arrived at Jason Miller's house. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people mowed their lawns every Saturday and waved to their neighbors. But behind the neat hedges and white picket fences, Something darker had been hiding for 20 years. Miller made no resistance to arrest. Standing in his doorway, he was pale and wearing a faded bathrobe, while the officers informed him of his rights. "I knew this day would come," he muttered hollowly. "I always knew." In the observation room at the station house, Claire watched as Miller sat staring down at the floor. The energy had shifted. A case that days earlier seemed put to bed was breaking down in front of her. Kearns' confession now felt like just a piece of the puzzle, a desperate half-truth to protect someone else. When Claire came into the room, Miller looked up. "You already have your man," he said quietly. "We have one of them," she replied, "but we think there's more to the story, and you're going to tell us what really happened that night." Miller leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You think I wanted any of this? Daniel was my mate. We worked together, drank together, shared tools and jobs and weekends. But that night, everything changed." He paused, his voice trembling. "He called me after midnight, said something bad had happened. When I got to him, Sarah was already gone. He was crying, shaking. He said it was an accident. I didn't know what to do. He begged me to help. I thought maybe we could just make it go away." Claire's heart sank. "So you helped him hide the body?" Miller nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "We didn't bury her. We left her there near the riverbank. We thought the rain would wash everything away, but it didn't. It never does it?" He buried his face in his hands. "For years I tried to forget, but Daniel couldn't. He'd call me drunk sometimes, crying. Said he saw her in his dreams. Said she was following him." Claire watched him closely. "Why didn't you come forward?" He looked up, his expression shattered. "Because I was scared. I didn't want to lose my family. My kids were little then, and Daniel swore he'd take all the blame if it ever came out. He said it was his fault alone." Outside the room, detectives exchanged glances. The story fit the evidence to a T. The second set of footprints near the lot, the cigarette butt found near the scene that had never been matched. All of it suddenly made sense. Claire stepped from the room, her mind reeling. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like victory. Two men had carried the weight of a single terrible night for 20 years, while a family carried the weight of silence. By the time the press learned about Miller's arrest, the city was in shock all over again. The headlines read, "Second arrest in Melbourne cold case, hidden accomplice revealed." Talk shows debated whether justice delayed was truly justice served. Old footage of Sarah played across every major channel, her image now forever etched into Australia's collective memory. At the courthouse, the men appeared side by side for the first time. Kearns looked defeated, his once proud posture broken. Miller barely raised his eyes. The room was packed, reporters, families, curious onlookers. When Sarah's parents entered, the chatter died instantly. They took their seats in the front row, holding hands. As the charges were read, Kearns and Miller both wept. It wasn't defiance or performance. It was the sound of two men finally crushed beneath the truth. Outside, rain began falling. Cameras flashed. Umbrellas opened, and in the middle of the storm stood Claire, staring at the courthouse steps. She'd seen dozens of cases close over her career, but this one left her hollow. Maybe because it wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about time, guilt, and the things people do when they can't face what they've done. That evening, Claire visited Sarah's grave for the first time. The headstone was simple. Sarah Louise McIntyre, 1982 to 2005. Love beyond measure, miss beyond words. Someone had left a small bouquet of daisies, slightly wilted from the rain. She crouched beside it, tracing the carved letters with her fingers. "I hope this brings you peace," she whispered. "You deserve so much more." She sat for a long time, listening to the wind and the trees, the distant hum of the city that had finally remembered her. Later, driving home through the wet Melbourne streets, Claire could not get the image of that night out of her mind, the van, the rain, the fear. But she also thought about Sarah's parents, who could finally close their daughter's file and stop waiting for a knock that never came. That, she told herself, had to be enough. Weeks later, the trial began. Both Kearns and Miller pled guilty, one to manslaughter, the other to being an accessory after the fact. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the sentence. 20 years. While being led away, Kearns turned to the gallery one last time. His eyes locked on Linda McIntyre's, and for a moment, time stood still. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But in that silent second, the look in her eyes spoke volumes. Not forgiveness, not hate, but the raw, unbearable truth that would never be undone by any confession, by any sentence. Outside, the community held a final vigil. Candles flickered in the cool evening air. Those who hadn't spoken in years stood shoulder to shoulder. The same streets where fear once lingered were now lit in quiet remembrance. Claire stood among them, anonymous in the crowd, while a person read aloud Sarah's favorite poem. It ended with the line, "Even the coldest night gives way to dawn." She closed her eyes and listened, the words washing over her. For the first time in 2 decades, Melbourne slept without wondering what had happened to Sarah McIntyre. And somewhere, in the gentle rustle of the trees or the soft patter of the rain, it felt like she was finally home.